Good morning and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical, and we are back this week after I took last week off. I wasn't feeling great and I wanted to rest up, but I am back. I am going to be talking more about the history of liberalism. Our last few couple of shows focused on classical history and England. So now we're going to talk about France, the French version of liberalism, how things evolved in France as opposed to how they evolved in England. What's different? What's the same? And we may get to their revolution this episode. It may be next episode. We'll see. What we're going to start with, though, is talking a little bit about how the Roman Empire broke down in England versus how it broke down in France. In England, the Roman governor declared himself emperor and invaded Gaul and got himself killed, after which the British Isles were not really part of the Roman sphere of influence anymore. The British kept on sort of living by Roman rules, but they were being invaded by the Anglo-Saxons within a few years. Even before the Anglo-Saxon invasions, they were focused more on their own issues, with Picts and with Scots invading from Ireland. And so they had their own issues to deal with, and they had to sort of operate on their own without the sort of external help that Rome had represented before. And this led to a sort of gray area where the Britons thought of themselves as still being Romans, but didn't really have any contact with Rome beyond their own officials in Britain. And they had to do things for themselves. Whereas Gaul was always to some degree part of the Roman Empire, though increasingly it was more subject to colonies of Roman military allies who were members of groups traditionally called barbarians, who joined the Roman army and were given essentially military reservations to live in their traditional lifestyles rather than completely Romanizing, though their communities were always Romanized to some extent because they were military communities based on serving Roman military needs. And so there were very complicated contradictions between the barbarians and the Romans during this period. France never stopped being part of Rome until Rome fell. And after Rome fell, the Franks, that's where France comes from, the Franks established their own empire, first ruled by the Merovingians, the descendants of Clovis, and then ruled by the Carolingians, the descendants of Charles Martel, who was never emperor himself, but who was a sort of regent and prime minister for Merovingian kings who didn't have much real power and were dependent on him to do things. His son Pippin would call himself king officially, and his son Charles, who would be called Charles the Great by posterity, Charlemagne, for those who are more used to the French. Charlemagne was declared Roman emperor by the Pope, which sort of reestablished, so to speak, the Roman Empire in France. And from that point on, there was this whole complicated between king and emperor, as the kings of the Western Franks, eventually the kings of France, were initially emperors, but were later displaced as emperors by the kings of the Eastern Franks and their Saxon successors. And these emperors didn't really pay a lot of attention to France, and the kings of the Western Franks became independent of the kings of the Eastern Franks. And the kings of the Eastern Franks kept calling themselves the Roman Emperor, which is where the Holy Roman Empire comes from, while the kings of the Western Franks just called themselves kings of the Franks until Philip Augustus, who called himself King of France. And the king became something different from the emperor, somebody at odds with the emperor, first fighting to maintain independence from the emperor, and then later on fighting to gain power and imperial standing at the expense of the emperor, trying to displace the Holy Roman Emperor as Roman Emperor, so to speak. This would become sort of a French article of politics for many, many years as time went on. But it started out as, disagreements over who was going to run the empire between the kings of the Western Franks and the kings of the Eastern Franks. There was more of a clean break between old imperial law and new imperial law in France than in England, ironically, probably because they were always part of one empire and then went right to becoming part of another empire. They took monarchy much more seriously in France than they did in England. The kings of the Franks went through some show of electing kings for a while, but ultimately royal power became hereditary, and the show of electing the king sort of faded away. There was when King Henry IV won all of his wars with the Parisians and the Spanish and was able to legitimately rule all of France. He started setting up his own new ways of doing things and started centralizing royal power at the expense of the nobility, in much the same way that the English kings tried to. But whereas in England this ended up with open warfare between the kings and their subjects repeatedly, with mixed luck for the kings, and the kings making formal concessions of liberalism in order to secure their succession. In France, we see royal power increase. We see the throne win the wars with its nobles. And we see all of this strengthen the throne at the expense of other French institutions. France is where the philosophical notion of the divine right of kings is most strongly expressed. France is where a king will one day claim, "I am the state." And France is where this notion of royal power leads to the best possible outcome for the state and the people really became most deeply deeply accepted. Uh, so much so that they had the same sort of trouble getting rid of their king that the English did, though they finally managed it and the English never did. It's difficult to decide exactly where to start when talking about specifics. I think the good place to start is with the establishment of the dynasty, the last real election of a king, when Count Hugh of Paris, the founder of the Capetian dynasty, was elected king. He went to a great deal of work to secure his royal inheritance in what were considered the central crown lands. And he spent a lot of time fighting wars with his own nobles in order to expand those crown lands. A lot of the enhancement of royal power at the expense of feudal power comes at the growth of the so-called Isle de France, the county whose seat was Paris, the territory that belonged to the Count of Paris and that became the personal fief of the King of France when he became King of France. The story of it getting bigger at the expense of barons and counts bordering on that land is really the beginning of the expansion of the French monarchy. The more land controlled by the French king directly means the more barons answering directly to him without a count in the way. Counts can rebel. Barons have a harder time without a coalition, whereas a count has barons under him who are technically loyal to him directly rather than the king directly, which means they're probably going to follow him in case of a rebellion. And they may actually get in trouble if they don't, more trouble than they might get into for following him against their king, because their direct oaths are to their count and not their king. So if their head isn't chopped off in the fighting or immediately afterwards, they're probably golden as long as they do what they're supposed to do and are loyal to the count, whether he wins or loses. Whereas being loyal to the king instead of your count creates all these extra risks. If the king is your count, though, then you have all sorts of incentive to be directly loyal to the king and to be a good baron and to fall in line. And so the history of the French monarchy is the history of the King of France acquiring more land within his own country so that he can then redistribute it to members of his family in such a way as to increase royal power and to weaken the feudal magnates who might otherwise try to run things the way they like, the way frequently happened in England. The ultimate success of the French monarchy comes much later, but it starts with Hugh of Paris becoming King of France and setting about the business of growing his little corridor in the middle of France around Paris. He would do this. He and his descendants would do this very successfully, to the point where one of his descendants, Philip, aka Philip Augustus, who was given that name very deliberately. He was the King of France who first started to take French territory back from England. Remember, the Duke of Normandy invaded England and became King of England. And in doing so, set off a series of conflicts between England and France and the English throne and English barons. All of these conflicts generally being resolved in ways that forced the winning king to embrace these Roman imperial laws that implied freedom for his nobles and subjects that may or may not have actually existed on a day-to-day basis, but which the King of England had to make these formal obsequences to in order to show his legitimacy. The King of France did not have to make these sort of obsequences. The King of France was able to simply be king as long as he won his battles. And if he didn't win his battles, then he would have problems until another strong king came along. But a weak king, because there weren't as many other institutions, just the king and the feudal system, a weak king still had ministers who attempted to exert power on his behalf, and their attempts to do so might lead to rebellion, and these rebellions might lead to changes of government, but they tended not to undermine royal authority because everybody was constantly paying lip service to royal authority when they established their new government, in much the same way that they paid lip service to these sort of Anglo-Saxon and leftover Roman institutions in England. So it's the opposite phenomenon, with many of the same results. You see constant struggles for power, and then you see this appeal to royal authority to legitimize power after these struggles are won. And just as it sort of undermines royal authority and establishes a quiet belief in the reality of liberalism among the ruling class of England, in France it establishes a quiet belief in the material reality of royal prerogative among the ruling class. And so even the weakest kings tend to have strong regents and strong ministers who exert power on their behalf. The infamous Cardinal Richelieu of the Three Musketeers was not someone who was trying to overthrow the king. He was the king's first minister. He was actually trying to strengthen the institution of the throne, where all his power came from. Being the king's guy was Richelieu's only security. So Richelieu was doing everything he could to strengthen the royal institutions that supported him and the state that he was creating for the French king, and sort of running as a powerful employee of the French king. And it was a great personal benefit to Richelieu for the king to become more powerful. Likewise, Richelieu's successor, Cardinal Mazarin, was equally dependent on Queen Anne of Austria, who was in charge of the regency government of the young King Louis XIV. And he needed to strengthen and further legitimize the institution of the throne and the absolute nature of royal power in order to strengthen his own position. Now, before I get too much into the specifics of that, I'm going to dial back a few years to talk about the wars of religion and about the whole problem of, quote, Habsburg encirclement, unquote, because this foreign policy issue would define French policy for many years. In a little before, in the late 15th century, Spain became very informally united by the marriage of King Ferdinand of Aragon, who was also one of the close heirs to the Castilian throne, to Princess Isabella of Castile, who was the legal heir to the Castilian throne even before Ferdinand, for the specific purpose of preventing any sort of disputes between Ferdinand's heirs and Isabella's heirs, and to secure the Castilian throne. Now this act to secure the Castilian throne's clean succession had a bunch of weird side effects based on other politics going on. The daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella married the Duke of Burgundy, who was also, because of the feudal obligations of the people of what's now the Netherlands and Belgium, was also the overlord of the modern Low Country. So the Duke of Burgundy, who is technically a subject of the King of France, but who historically has been at war with the King of France and allied with England, marries the daughter of the new king and queen of what isn't yet Spain, but what everyone is going to think of Spain because of her son. And they have a son, Charles, who becomes Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire and King Charles I of Spain. Charles was a mythological figure during his own lifetime, and even more so after his death. He was responsible for the sack of Rome, the prevention of Italy coalescing as any sort of kingdom of its own, as sort of a buffer between France and Germany, and made it a battlefield between France and Germany for years instead, centuries even. He helped make things difficult for Henry VIII in ways that were directly responsible for England becoming Protestant, trying to block Henry's divorce because Henry's wife was his aunt, and he had obligations to his aunt to keep her from being divorced. And when he became King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor, all of a sudden, France is right in the middle of this superstate, girdling it on either side. And it was only because of the personal difficulties of Charles' reign that he ended up abdicating and making his brother Ferdinand emperor in Germany and his son Philip king in Spain. Philip would marry Bloody Mary and would be responsible for his share of English drama. But Philip was also very responsible for a lot of French drama because the Dutch revolted against his rule because he was an asshole. And I mean, it really comes down to Philip being an asshole more than anything else. There were so many chances for the kings of Spain to resolve all of their issues with the Dutch rebels and make peace on all sorts of agreeable terms and keep all that wealth and power of the Netherlands for themselves. And instead, Philip just had to be an asshole about it. And it's just, that's one of the problems with absolute monarchy, of course. If the king's an asshole, it causes all sorts of problems for everybody else. But this war between Philip and the Dutch threatened to further encircle France, became of great concern to the French, and the French, as a result, helped the Dutch win their independence in the long run. By the same token, the French would be fighting wars against Ferdinand and his descendants. And a lot of these wars were fought in Italy, what we call the Italian Wars, directly between Charles and his allies and supporters, and the various kings of France and their allies and supporters. The involvement in the Italian wars led to all sorts of drama, but didn't really change much, as ultimately the Italian wars were sort of a draw, and French and Austria both got some of what they wanted, and Spain got some of what they wanted, but France was still encircled by the Habsburgs. The Dutch Revolution took some pressure off. These wars generally worked in such a way that they strengthened the throne. And more importantly, they changed the sort of dogmatic attitude towards religion of the French state as first, on the one hand, the French kings were in a bloody conflict with the French Protestants over power in France. But on the other hand, they supported Protestants in Germany and the Netherlands, and to some degree in England, because it benefited them to weaken the Spanish and the empire. And so France is involved in all of these power politics, all of which greatly strengthen the French king and strengthen the institutions around the French king, and also create a lot of discontent among the aristocracy. Many of the great aristocrats become Protestants as a way of expressing their grievances against the crown. The Protestants' grievances against the crown become tangled up in religious beefs. The war ultimately leads to this sort of philosophical neutrality between Catholics and Protestants, and the Protestant king, Henry IV, becomes the Catholic king, Henry IV, in order to resolve a political rebellion by the people of Paris. They are not rebelling for more rights or more privileges. They're rebelling because they only want a king who's Catholic. And the king finally concedes to them, saying, you know, Paris is worth a mass. Who cares about religion? And very cynically changes his professed beliefs in order to become king of France, while at the same time declaring freedom of religion for all his former fellow Protestants. But this doesn't really solve the problem, because his son is raised Catholic, and his son hires a Catholic priest, Cardinal Richelieu, to run his government. And Cardinal Richelieu does not have this whole Protestant thing at home, and fights a war to destroy Protestant power, both because they're Protestants and because they're a threat to royal power. At the same time, he involves France in the 30 Years' War in Germany in order to weaken the empire. And the result of the 30 Years' War is that, to a certain degree, the emperor wins, but the peace treaty that is signed guts the empire as a political force and devolves power upon the princes of the empire in such a way as to really make the title of emperor meaningless. It's just a few years after this that Voltaire will write that the Holy Roman Empire is neither holy nor Roman nor yet an empire. And that really says it all right there. But that title of emperor is still clung to by the Austrian royal family, because even though now all the Habsburgs really have is Austria, they have that title of emperor that makes Austria more important than just another European duchy. It's better to be emperor than duke in a continent run by kings, right? So France beats Austria in a way that weakens the official empire and makes France the new unofficial seat of empire, as France replaces the Holy Roman Empire as the most powerful force in continental Europe. Which, of course, gets the English worried about the French in much the way they had been worried about the Spanish before. But that brings us, but that was back for the English part of things. They had already fought at this point the first 100 Years' War with the English. In England, because of the failures of the 100 Years' War, it ended up strengthening liberalism and parliamentarianism. In France, the ultimate successes of the 100 Years' War end up strengthening the throne in exactly the same way. And so what you see now is Louis XIII's son, Louis XIV, becomes king, and his mother, Anne of Austria, assumes the regency, and her guy, Cardinal Mazarin, becomes prime minister in place of Cardinal Richelieu. We get a whole lot of discontent from the French nobility. This leads to a very confused war of three different chapters called the Fronde. The first chapter of the Fronde, the Parliament's Fronde, happens because of a refusal of the French Parliament to post a specific set of laws demanded by the regency, on the basis that the regent is not the king and only the king can do X, Y, and Z. This leads to the city of Paris rebelling against the regency government. It leads to Paris being temporarily taken over by a sort of bureaucratic middle class city government. They called themselves the Commune of Paris, which is a name that'll come again later a few times. But we're not particularly communist in the way we mean it now. Commune was a way of saying that they were an alliance of people of the city rather than recognizing any external feudal authority. But this version of the Commune of Paris was not so much truly anti-royal as they were seeking to put the regency in its place and uphold powers of courts and feudal lords against encroachment by the regency when there wasn't a king to encroach them. The parliamentary fronde didn't last very long. A force under the Prince of Condé took Paris back. But immediately after the prince took Paris back, there starts to be an argument between the winners. The great princes of France want more of a share in the regency themselves and want to weaken Queen Anne and Cardinal Mazarin. And so the second chapter of war starts, the Prince's Fronde, which is really the most fun and most disgusting. The two greatest heroes of France, the Prince of Condé and the Viscount Turenne, end up trying to kill each other on behalf of of people that the Prince of Condé would call some of the worst people in France. And they really don't have a lot of respect for their fellow. And everybody's kind of happy when King Louis XIV is old enough to throw out all his governors and say, hey, I'm in charge. I'm going to be my own first minister. The king is going to take charge and put things to right. And Louis XIV proceeds to win a war with Spain, the Spanish Fronde, because the Prince of Condé isn't quite done rebelling, defects to the Spanish. There's a great big war, which culminates with what's called the Battle of the Dunes outside of Dunkirk. The Battle of the Dunes ends with the French defeating the Spanish and taking Dunkirk from the English, who had held it before. And taking it from the Spanish and giving it to the English as part of a short-term agreement. I'm sorry, they held Calais before, and it wouldn't last nearly as long. And Condé ends up coming back with his tail between his legs, making submission, being exiled to his estates. The French and the Spanish make peace in such a way that the French get pretty much everything they want at the time. And Louis XIV gets this really big idea of himself and thinks he can keep on fighting wars forever. Louis's personal sublimation of feudalism into absolutism and his creation of an institutional government completely dependent on royal power, in which the feudal magnates are reduced to his personal servants and attendants in order to curry his favor if they want any share in his government. And it really works beyond, I really have to say, beyond his wildest dreams. I don't know if even Louis expected to be as successful as he was. But as a result, it completely discredits the idea of anything but strong royal government for many, many years. and makes everybody even more dependent on the kings, but the future kings aren't Louis and aren't willing to focus on running the state or being the state to the exclusion of nearly everything else to the same degree as Louis. And even Louis's final triumph, when he ends the encirclement of France by the Habsburgs by making his grandson Philip, King Philip V of Spain, even this grand triumph is ultimately scuttled by the fact that while he's victorious in Spain, his victory everywhere else is Pyrrhic at best, after defeat, tremendously hard earned. And he can't, and the best peace agreement he can make says, okay, the French royal house can run both France and Spain, but those two countries can't ever have one king or become one country. And he's sort of stuck with that. And it sort of both undermines his victory and creates political problems for the future. But more than that, Louis's successors just aren't Louis. And they are not capable of running the French state. They are dependent on ministers who are not Richelieu or Mazarin. And Louis's great-grandson and initial heir, Louis XV, when his first chief minister dies, decides to be his own chief minister despite not really being qualified for it, and mismanaging his government even further into debt and defeat. The one great military victory of his era in the War of the Austrian Succession sees France returning almost everything it won to Austria in return for a specific set of political concessions that doesn't stop the next war from happening anyway. And the next war that happens, the 7 Years' War, as we called it in North America, the French and Indian War, ends up becoming a big deal. It's this major world war. Now, the French are now fighting their second 100 Years' War. The first 100 Years' War was the attempt by the English to dominate France. The second 100 Years' War was the attempt by the French to dominate Europe and the world, while England sort of attempted to maintain this anti-French balance of power that prevented France from really ever achieving everything it wanted, which was done remarkably successfully despite many French successes. And just as the French ultimately won the first Civil War over France itself, the English ultimately won the second 100 Years' War against the French for world imperium, so to speak. Though we have to ask this, considering how it turned out how it all turned out in North America. But still, the English considered themselves the winner of the second 100 Years' War, even with American independence. And a king of France who would later be killed by a revolutionary government that was sick of him invested a great deal of military power and official treasure into defeating England and setting up an independent American republic for the entire realpolitik of wanting to scuttle British hegemony. Of course, French hegemony would be scuttled by the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. But that's an episode, that is for a future episode. In the short term, the thing that we have to think about is that France was developing under exactly opposite principles but similar process to England. Every conflict between the French crown and the French nobles ended with some sort of accommodation that affirmed royal power at the expense of the nobles, in the same way that every conflict between English oligarchs and the English crown ended with some sort of lip service to liberalism that kept the king from getting everything he wanted, even though he was king now. And so in France, the king gets everything he wants consistently for a very long time. Even when he's not really the one running the government, power is impossible without him. He is necessary, whether he is useful or not. And it is this struggle over the conflict between the king's necessity and his growing lack of utility that leads to French ideas of republicanism and the French Revolution. On that note, I want to thank everyone who joined me this week. I hope to be back next week with more talk about France, specifically the French Revolution. The last note of this episode is that the word fronde specifically means slingshot, and it is the sling used by French shepherds to fight off wolves. And this whole civil war is called the Fronde because essentially the King of France was fighting off all the wolves around him with a slingshot and establishing himself as the legitimate French authority. This seems to be very anti-liberal, but this very sort of struggle between the king's necessity and his growing lack of utility, as Louis XVI was even less useful than Louis XV when it came to running things, becomes important. I want to thank you, everybody, for joining me. And until next week, I'll tweet at you. Take care.